Namaste everybody. Welcome to the fifth video in the overall series and introduction to Sanatana Dharma. This is the fourth video in the subset Books and Prophets. Today we will touch upon the Mahabharata. By the way, from this video onwards, towards the end, I am actually adding a slide which will cover the topics that I have in mind. So it will mention the topics that I have already covered, and it will also mention the topics that I wish to cover in the forthcoming slides. I request, a lot of you have been very kind to watch these videos. I request your inputs on what further topics may be covered if something comes to your mind on those lines. Also, in the references section, I have given a link to a particular book. Now, the Mahabharata, like let's say a lot of other Hindu literature, has been interpreted in various weird ways also. So there is a certain gentleman who I consider my guru in a way, called Sri Samavedam Shanmuga Sarma. So he actually narrated the story of the Mahabharata over 18 days, taking the source, the Sanskrit source, and I think 5 years after, 4 or 5 years after the initial narration of his discourse, that entire discussion has been brought out as a book. So the link for that, for those of you who are interested, unfortunately, as of now, that is available only in Telugu. But if anybody is interested, I have provided a link in the end, and do go through that. Let's proceed. So let us get started with today's details. The Mahabharatam obviously is the second epic for Hindus, the first being the Ramayana. The Mahabharatam is the world's largest epic with 100,000 or 1 lakh shlokas. This has actually also been referred to as the Panchama Veda. So whatever has been referred to as the subject matter in the Vedas, the Upanishads, all of these details have actually been kind of preserved in the Mahabharata. In fact, when Vyasa starts visualizing the Mahabharata, he actually kind of sees the origin of the cosmos, the entire process of creation. Because of all of these reasons, the Mahabharatam is also referred to as the Panchama Veda or the fifth Veda. There is a very important saying that is associated with the Mahabharata, which says, Yanne hasti na tad kvachit, yat na iha asti na tad kvachit. Basically, what this means is, what does not exist here, yat na iha asti na tad kvachit. Whatever is not there here is not to be found anywhere else. That is actually a description of the depth of content that is present in the Mahabharata. Now, as everybody knows, Veda Vyasa is the author of the Mahabharata. Now, when Vyasa was visualizing the Mahabharata, one interesting concept, both the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, Valmiki and Vyasa, in both cases, the sages actually visualize, so they act as mantra drashtas. So the Ramayana and Mahabharata are not just shlokas. The text of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata cannot just be considered to be made up of shlokas, but they are actually mantras. Now, when Veda Vyasa was visualizing the Mahabharata, the torrent of thoughts was so fast that he could not put them down in writing. Therefore, the Lord Brahma advises him to take help from Ganapati, Vinayaka. Now, when Vinayaka comes to Vyasa's aid, he puts a condition. He says, Vyasa, I will write this down. However, you should not pause. So if you are telling me something, your narration should be continuous. I should not have a pause in my writing. Now, obviously, there would have been certain places. There were certain places where Vyasa wanted to say, put certain thoughts into shlokas. Okay. Now, if he had a situation like this, where he required a little time to formulate something, he used to utter a couple of shlokas or mantras. The complexity of these shlokas is such that Vinayaka himself used to take a little time, ponder about those, and then write them down. Now, in the time that Vinayaka took to kind of ponder about the shlokas, Vyasa would compose new ones in his mind. These shlokas are said to number 8,800 in the Mahabharata. Vyasa himself says that the meaning of these shlokas is known to him, his son Shuka, and there is a very important narrative in the Mahabharata called Sanjaya. He says he may or may not know the meaning of these shlokas. That is the complexity associated with these 8,800 shlokas. Now, the text in a way has three categories, or the content in the Mahabharata is threefold, or is of three kinds. The first is something called the Akhyanam, which is the primary story of the Bharatas. There was King Dushyanta, his wife Shakuntala, their son Bharata. So the entire, let's say, all the protagonists and the antagonists that you see in the Mahabharata are Bharata's descendants, and therefore they are called Bharatas. Bharatadesha obviously is the name given to the country itself, is the name given to our country itself. In fact, even the constitution says that India, that is Bharat, right? So that's the derivative. So the Akhyanam, or the primary story, is about the tale of the Bharatas. Now, the number of shlokas in the Akhyanam portion are 24,000. This is the exact number of shlokas that are present in the Valmiki Ramayana, for those who remember. The second aspect is something called the Upakhyanam. Remember that Puranam, Upapuranam, Rashtrapati, Uparashtrapati, Akhyanam, Upakhyanam. So they are stories not directly related to the Mahabharata, but are important in their own right. For example, there is the story of Nala and Damayanti. The Ramayana itself is actually narrated by a person who Yudhishthira when he is in the forest. That way, there are a lot of stories which are kind of subsets in the Mahabharata, but are not directly related to the primary story. Then we can say that there is a third component. We can refer to that as the Upadesha. Let's say moral precepts. The Bhagavad Gita, not only moral, it could be something to do with life in general also, Upadesham. Now, the Bhagavad Gita as an example. There is a parva called the Anushasanika parva, where Bhishma narrates a lot of things to the Pandavas while I believe he is on the bed of arrows. That way, there are a lot of precepts, probably that is the term, and these constitute the Upadesha portion of the Mahabharata. Now, apart from this, the Mahabharata has three objectives. Now, for those of you who remember, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Puranas, all these are part of what is called Jaya or Jayam. There are four objectives, actually speaking: Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, which are the four ideals of human life. I will try to cover these in a different video. Keeping these aside, the story itself has three objectives. The first is something which is called, or you can say it as Vasudevasya Mahatmyam. Vasudeva is Krishna. The glory of Krishna is one of the primary objectives of the story. The second is Pandavanam Satyata, the truth or the righteousness of the Pandavas. Third is Durvrittam Dhartarashtranam, or Dhartarashtranam Durvrittam. Sorry. Now, where are the Kauravas here? So one interesting point is the term Kaurava applied to only Duryodhana and his siblings. They had one sister also, Dushala, is actually wrong. The Pandavas and the so-called Kauravas are actually part of the Kuru dynasty. Therefore, the sons of Pandu and the sons of Dhritarashtra are both Kauravas. Pandavas were called that since they were the sons of the king Pandu. Since they are the children of Dhritarashtra, the technically correct term for Duryodhana and his siblings is actually Dhartarashtras. So the glory of Lord Krishna, who's said to be the supreme divinity personified himself, then the righteousness of the Pandavas and the non-righteousness, let's say, of the bad behavior or the bad character of the sons of Dhritarashtra, or the children of Dhritarashtra, are the three components of the Mahabharata. Then this number 18 has it keeps popping up here and there in the Mahabharata. We have 18 parvas or chapters or books in the Mahabharata. The battle or the actual Kurukshetra battle goes on for 18 days. Then the Bhagavad Gita has 18 chapters, 700 shlokas in the Bhagavad Gita, divided between 18 chapters. Then there is also this concept called Akshauhini. See, there are different kinds of balas, or let's say fighting forces. Okay, this is a general concept. Padati Dalam, which is basically the infantry. Then you have the horse riders, you have the charioteers, or people who are actually fighting on the chariot. Then there is something called a Gajabalam, which is the obviously the elephant force, so to say. Now, a certain number of each of these components a few thousands of each of these, a few thousands, few lakhs of each of these constitutes something called an Akshauhini. The starting of the Mahabharata war has 18 Akshauhinis ready to fight. So there were seven Akshauhinis on the Pandava side, and there were 11 Akshauhinis on the Kauravas or the Dhartarashtra's side. So there were 18 Akshauhinis of fighting forces arrayed in total when we combine both sides at the beginning of the Mahabharata war. By the end of the war, by the time, let's say, Duryodhana is also dead, on the Dhartarashtra side, practically, if you leave out the elders like Dhritarashtra, only Ashwathama, because he could not be killed. He was a person who could not be killed. And Kripacharya, one of the early teachers of the Pandavas and the Dhartarashtras, these two are left alive. And on the Pandava side, there are the 5 Pandavas and Draupadi, obviously. So most of, or you can say 18 Akshauhinis of fighting forces actually perished in this particular battle. Now, the Ramayana is set in something called the Treta Yuga, or a certain cycle or a certain period of time. The Mahabharata is set in the Dwapara Yuga. In fact, the Mahabharata is set at the Sandhi or the conjunction of the Dwapara Yuga and the Kali Yuga. One of the concluding parts or one of the concluding incidents in the Mahabharata is actually the passing away of Krishna. And when Krishna leaves the earth is when the Kali Yuga, the present age, let's say we can call it the age of sin, so to say, is said to have entered when Krishna left the earth. Now, in both these stories, in both the tales, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, there are Asuric forces and Daivic forces, if I want to use those terms, basically divine and not so divine, or maybe evil forces arrowed on both sides. So basically what happens is when the demonic forces, if I want to use that term, gain the upper hand, there are people who go to say Narayana, Shiva, and say that, okay, the earth is crying because of the weight of the, let's say, the evil people or the sinners on the earth. You need to incarnate and reduce the load on the earth. There, basically what happens in the Ramayana, we had people like Ravana, Kumbhakarna on the Asuric side. Vishnu, and on the, obviously Vishnu took birth as Rama. Apart from that, Brahma, Indra, all the other gods also, let's say, send a part of their essence to take birth on the earth. So we had Sugriva, all the Vanaras, Jambavan had an Amsha or a part of Brahma in the Ramayana. In the Mahabharata, Krishna obviously is Parabrahma himself. Then the Pandavas were born because of certain gods. The Kauravas had the Rakshasamsa in them. In fact, and in both these stories, God is kind of the director. Let's say we have the protagonist and the antagonist. God is the director overseeing the entire, let's say, story. So this is what probably this is one of the simple definitions of the concept of Leela. So all of this is divine pastime. Now, this is a very interesting story in the Mahabharata itself. When the Pandavas are in the forest, Karna gives an idea to Duryodhana saying, why don't we go to the forest and kind of array our wealth, like show off our wealth so that they feel jealous and they feel sad. Now, in the course of acting upon Karna's advice, Duryodhana is taken prisoner by a Gandharva called Chitrasena, and he is freed by the Pandavas. At this point of time, Duryodhana is in extreme sorrow. Like the Pandavas are somebody who he has hated from birth, from his childhood, and he actually went to the forest to kind of make fun of them, right? And suddenly he is at their mercy. They have actually liberated him from the clutches of Chitrasena, the Gandharva. So he decides to end his life. Okay. Now, when he embarks upon this, there are certain Asuric forces in the netherworlds, the Patal and the worlds that are supposed to exist below the earth. They actually summon Duryodhana to their presence and say, why are you doing this? We have a lot of hopes on you. In fact, so all of us who remember that story, like Narakasura, Krishna, Sadhyavama, that battle, right? So when they actually give a list that what all Asuras took birth as who, they actually give out a list. So Narakasura his Amsha part is said to have gone into Karna. So this way, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata have divine and evil forces on both sides of the story. Plus, a very interesting positioning of Surya and Indra. In the Ramayana, Surya's Amsha is Sugriva, Indra's Amsha is Vali. Vali is on the negative side, so to say. In the Mahabharata, it's the other way around. Surya's son, there was Sugriva who was positive. Here, it is Karna who, though Kunti's son, is actually on the side, on the evil side. In fact, it is said that probably had Karna not been there, Duryodhana would not have mustered up the courage to fight the Pandavas, and this played a very key role in the elimination of the Asuric forces. So till the time a divine, let's say, essence actually went to the side of the Asuras could not muster up enough courage to fight and get eliminated, all part of Leela. Now, Indra's son obviously is Arjuna. He is on the side of good in the Mahabharata. So we have this interesting, probably contrapositioning where they kind of switch sides in both the epics. Just an interesting side note. Now, the Mahabharatam has also given us certain other important texts, obviously. The Bhagavad Gita is possibly the most well-known. Then there is also something called the Vishnu Sahasranamam, extremely popular down south. I am not aware of the extent of popularity of the Sahasranama concept in the north or the rest of the country as such. I apologize if I'm mistaken. I'll be happy if I'm mistaken. I'm sure people are aware, but I am personally not aware of this. I'll not go into what these are right now. However, these are two other important, let's say, texts which have come out of the Mahabharata. One is the Bhagavad Gita. Second is the Vishnu Sahasranamam. The Vishnu Sahasranamam, by the way, was narrated by Bhishma when he was lying on the bed of arrows. Bhagavad Gita, obviously, everybody knows. At the beginning of the Kurukshetra war, Arjuna is kind of sad. He's dejected that why do I need this wealth and kingdom and all of this? I can't kill my own kin. That's when Krishna tells him the importance of doing one's duty, so on and so forth. In the Vishnu Sahasranamam, after the war, the Pandavas actually go to Bhishma because he was an extremely wise person. He was Bhishma Acharya, right? So one of the questions that Yudhishthira, Dharmaraja, actually asked him certain questions. Who's the supreme god? Some questions like that. In response to those questions, Bhishma narrates the glory of Krishna, Vishnu, and that is actually available to us today as the Vishnu Sahasranamam. Then, so why I have put this sugar and sugar cane, I'll just mention this. This is the last slide for today's discussion. Basically, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata have become so ingrained into our culture. Hinduism itself is actually so ingrained in our culture. These are certain phrases that I'm using as examples. For example, Lakshmana Rekha, actually not available in the Valmiki Ramayana. There was no story of the Lakshmana Rekha. This somehow came into being from some other place. However, the concept of Lakshmana Rekha, where you should not cross a certain boundary. Ravana Kashtam is a term that I've heard in Andhra. I'm not sure about outside the place. Basically, apparently when Ravana was created, he being a huge asura and all, his fire went on burning for a very long time. So any persistent problem is referred to as a Ravana Kashtam. Then Ramabanam, Rama's arrow, is said to be something without, let's say, a counter, something which is a panacea, a cure-all, or something which simply cannot be fought against, is something called Ramabanam. Then Uttara Kumara, part of the Mahabharata, he initially praises his valor, saying, I will beat the Kauravas in battle, and then he runs away from battle. Later on, he regains his bravery, he gains bravery. However, somebody who, let's say, praises himself and then chickens out in the end is said to be an Uttara Kumara. Sugriva from the Mahabharata, again an order which cannot be defied or rejected, is supposed to be a Sugriva Agnya order. Chakravyuham, Padmavyuham, everybody knows, a very complex situation out of which people can't find an exit, in which Abhimanyu actually passed away. Danakarna, obviously Karna was known for his donation. That was one of the positive aspects of Karna. Agni Pariksha from the Ramayana. Urta Bhakti is a phrase. Urta basically in Telugu means squirrel. So there is the folk story, again not mentioned in the Valmiki Ramayana, of a squirrel helping out in the construction of the bridge across the ocean, right? Now, the squirrel obviously cannot contribute anything significant, materially significant, but it does that as its duty, as its devotion to God. So whether or not it makes any material impact, and whatever is the quantum of the help that it can offer, the squirrel actually offers this to the Vanaras in the Ramayana, in a folk story associated with the Ramayana. That way, the reason I'm saying sugar and sugarcane is Hinduism, epics, Puranas are the lifeblood of this country. So if anybody says that, look at India apart from this culture, the Vedic culture, the Hindu culture, it is basically like removing the juice or the sugar from sugarcane, the jaggery sugar, the juice from sugarcane, and leaving that bagasse, right? Leaving that empty, those fibers, that will be this culture. So this is something that we need to realize, keep in mind, that if this culture, if this land has survived so long, this is the only ancient land that is still existent in, by and large, the same way. So if you look at, say, the situation thousands of years back and today, the culture of the land is part of an unbroken continuum. This is because the culture of the land is rooted in the Vedas, the Puranas, the Itihasas. Therefore, if anybody says that, look at India minus Hinduism, culture, Vedas, you are basically looking at a body devoid of life. You are looking at sugarcane without that sweetness. So on this note of Urta Bhakti, that contribute whatever you can, irrespective of the kind of material advantage that you can actually provide to somebody, I would like to end this particular discussion. Thank you.